Hello and welcome to another episode of the KOFISI Connect podcast series. I don't know about you, but I didn't know what a seed ball was till a couple of weeks ago. I also didn't know that you could plant seeds way ahead before the rainy season comes. Well, if you're like me, worry not, because in studio today we have Teddy Kinyanjui from Seedballs Kenya, who focus on the reforestation of indigenous trees in a very unique way. And he will tell us all about this and what a creative innovation it is. Welcome to KOFISI 9, Teddy, and thank you for making time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Bella. It's my pleasure to be here.
I am really looking forward to this. So please tell us a little more about Seedballs Kenya and the genius idea that's behind it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. So the genius idea really that's sort of behind Seedballs Kenya was luckily us observing natural processes and seeing trees coming back in the wild and questioning who planted all of the trees to begin with in Kenya. And it's, of course, seeds that fall in the right place at the right time. So I was very lucky myself and my business partner, Elson Karstad, both very much enjoy being in the outdoors, cycling, going on safaris, camping in the parks, what have you. So I think that exposure to seeing these wild systems and wild places in Kenya and learning about how trees grow in nature was definitely instrumental to us creating this whole seed ball project.
Okay, and when did you guys start it?
So we started it in 2016. It was sort of birthed out of our mutual work in the charcoal industry. So my family business has been making energy-saving cook stoves and barbecues and ovens that use charcoal and firewood for many, many years. He started the briquetting business in Kenya of using the old waste dust from where they sell charcoal to make charcoal briquettes. Through that, both of us had a lot of experience of knowing what types of trees are being used, where is charcoal coming from, why are people making those types of trees into charcoal in those particular areas. And we'd had a strong tree planting program in our company since the early 2000s. My late father, Maxwell Kinyanjui, and one of his good friends, Martin Dunford from the Carnivore and Tamarind Group. So you can imagine, we make charcoal jikos. Carnivore uses lots of charcoal for nyama choma. So they got to talking and thinking about, well, how do we actually grow enough trees to make sure 5-10 decades from now, there's still enough charcoal for people to enjoy traditional nice nyama choma stuff. So we've been doing the traditional tree planting where you dig a hole, you get a tree seedling in a plastic bag, put it in, water it, add manure, what have you, which is totally fine and it works. We just started finding that on a large scale, it becomes very expensive. All the logistics behind it, the transportation of the seedlings, a lot of times you're trying to match it with the rainy season, and then with climate change, the rains are shifting a lot. So you either have your truck filled with seedlings stuck in the mud somewhere, or you end up watering all of the seedlings because the rains failed, and a week later the sun is blazing down. So after 15 years of doing tree planting in Kitui, Narok, and Kajiado, we really faced a lot of these challenges in lots of different environments, especially in these dryland areas, which is where most of charcoal comes from for the big cities and urban centers of Kenya. The light bulb behind the seed balls came about once I had a small planting contract in Mololongo, and I was near the highway, and I was on one side of the fence on this private guy's land, and doing that whole thing of, the plastic bag seedling is 25 shillings, digging a hole is 10 shillings each, or whatever. And as we were doing all of that and somewhat struggling to plant, I think it was 1,000 trees at the time, I happened to look over the other side of the fence on the side of the highway, and the Kenya National Highway Authority people, they hire people to keep the sides of the roads clean and slash the grass and bushes and everything. One of the people was actually struggling to cut down one of the same types of trees, a small seedling that we were struggling to pay people to grow. And this is 5 meters difference between the two things. So that got me thinking, wait a minute, how is it that this Acacia xanthofolia, the yellow fever tree, is growing basically wild on the side of the road, and here we are spending about 50 shillings each with a lot of time, effort and sweat and tears to sort of force this tree to start growing. That led me to looking into it a lot. It turns out a lot of the places where river sand for the building industry is transported and deposited, the river sand contains seeds, of course, because the trees grow along the riverbank. So as they're driving up the highways, those seeds are blowing off in the wind, landing on the side of the road. And because of a bit of extra water or whatever, a lot of them germinate and start growing. It's a bit of a bone of contention because I always see the Kenya highway people paying money to grow trees, but yet they pay people to probably cut down millions of trees on the edges of the roads in the whole country. All they'd have to do is just teach people what's a tree, and when it's too close to the highway, fine, remove it. But if it's right up against the fence, there's no need to cut it down.
That's true.
Anyway, so that got us really excited about looking at how seeds are naturally spread in the wild. Because of course, then we started thinking, wait a minute, who grew all of these millions of trees we've been cutting down all over Kenya for the last 100 years? Those initial ones, of course, were not in a plastic bag with someone digging a hole with a djembe. So natural regeneration via seeds was a very interesting concept that we started now investigating. So I went to KEFRI, the Kenya Forest Research Institute up in Maguga, who we'd been buying seeds from years before. And I bought a selection of dryland acacia trees that are suitable for around Kajiado. So we have a small test plot where I went and spread them all out. And that year it didn't rain. So it was very similar to this one. I had a few small rains and then the sun came out. And when I went back to investigate, almost all of the seeds had been eaten by mice and birds and insects, because of course natural indigenous tree seeds are food for hundreds of different types of animal species. So that led me thinking there's sort of two options from this side. You either throw out more seeds that all of the mice can eat, which becomes very expensive, or find a way to protect the seeds. So this is when I approached Elson from Chardas Limited, because he's a very good engineer, and I know he's very clever with making machines and what have you. And we started looking at how could we actually use the same waste charcoal dust to coat indigenous tree seeds to send back to those areas where the charcoal came from in the beginning. And that's really fascinating, that charcoal dust cycle, because so much of it, when in the older parts of Nairobi, like Kibra and Eastleigh, you dig through these like 10-foot tall piles of charcoal dust, and we actually find coins as far back as 1930 that someone just dropped and lost in the pile. And you kind of see urban archaeology. You see the first couple of years of plastic bags arriving to Kenya, then you see the scratch cards from SafariCon, then you see the corona masks these days. You kind of see these layers. So it's a dual-pronged thing, because we're also helping clean up the town and those areas where the charcoal dust is thrown away as waste. And I really like the thought of being able to use that same waste to hopefully plant a tree back in the same place where that charcoal came from to begin with. So it's a sort of full cycle system.
That's so interesting, because I was wondering how comes you just decided to use charcoal. That's really interesting to see.
Here's one of the coins.
Oh, wow.
I'll send you a photo of one later.
How long did...
That's 1940 something.
Oh, wow.
So, you can imagine how much that was worth. 10 cents that long ago? For someone who lost that was probably so furious.
Okay.
But it's so interesting to now find this many years later. Hopefully their grandchildren will benefit from the trees that we're planting in that same area.
That's really true. And are there other competitors around who've done the same thing with charcoal?
So there are people doing charcoal briquettes, the ones for cooking. They call it makaya kutangeneza, sort of squeezed together. So there are various people all over the country doing that as well these days. And then from the seedball side of it, no one else is really doing it with charcoal dust, as far as we know. There's a bit of a push of seedballs in England and the States. They do them for wildflowers a lot, for butterflies and beautification, what have you. In India, there's a huge seedball movement. And luckily through our work over the years, we've had quite a few viral videos and what have you that have gone out. And so we've been in touch with people in over 15 countries, from Peru to Sri Lanka to Thailand to what have you, asking about how do we do seedballs. And since I've never really been to any of those places, I just tell them, just go and find in nature what's working and use indigenous plants and copy that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, people think, well, definitely charcoal comes from the trees. Do you ever get any pushback that you're using charcoal and you're still planting trees? Is there any conflict of interest in there?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. I think the charcoal industry is extremely misunderstood in Kenya, given that it's worth more than the tea industry in terms of revenue, more than 1 million people employed directly and indirectly around it. Everyone eats nyama choma on the weekend.
Yes.
And yet it's this whole system of, because it's banned, it means that only the cartels and mafia are the ones dealing in it, rather than it being formalized. And they had charcoal producing associations at one point, which have all disbanded at the moment. But as far as sustainable energy sources go, for one of the many things that we'll be using in Kenya, because there will be a day when everyone has LPG gas, everyone's going to microwave. But again, back to that cultural side, on Sunday afternoon when the game is on, you're going to be eating grilled ribs or whatever it is.
That's true.
And also the big push we've seen now is because of urbanization, so many people don't usually even cook lunch. You go out and eat at a hotel or whatever, and a lot of those places know the best tasting whatever is cooked on charcoal. And so for us, it's always been a very sadly missed opportunity from the government to really empower rural communities in sustainable forest management. Because if you want tomatoes or onions, you grow tomatoes and onions.
Yeah.
So if we want wood and charcoal and building posts and all of the wood products that one gets,
you might as well
rather
do
than
it
just
the right
banning
way.
and pretending it's not happening, why not give people sustainable long-term jobs? And I always joke about how it's such a huge industry that's not really taxed, it's not really understood. And there's not, as far as I know, a single university that gives a PhD or master's program in charcoal production. And when I ask people that, would you go to university and study kuchoma maka? Almost everyone laughs. And yet here we're talking about a thing in hundreds of millions of shillings that's a national energy source. And yet homegrown local solutions and systems and education geared towards making that sustainability is just pushed out of hand, ignored. They'll have big conferences about how evil charcoal is, and at that same conference, what's for lunch? Charcoal grilled food. And so I hope, at some point, especially some of the listeners, if you're involved in industries and stuff, we can all look at how can we switch this from being a slightly illicit, demonized source to, as we're moving away from fossil fuels, as we're moving more towards internal, local, sustainable economies, how do we empower all of these people to grow more trees? And for us, Seedballs is a perfect system of using waste from this industry to regrow a lot of the things that were lost. And if some will be used for charcoal in the future, so be it. Better than someone stealing trees from a national park or something.
That's true. And how long do the seeds take to grow?
So it very much depends on the species. Some species are very quick growing, like the Sesbania sesban is a very nice agroforestry tree, good for livestock fodder, firewood. That one you can have one as tall as you or I in a year and a half if it's good soil and good rains. On the other end, you have like the African olive that's very slow growing, and that one will live 400, 500 years. And so it really depends. But it's very much on, as long as you're getting the right type of seed to the right location. So our big thing is whatever is being cut down where you live, grow more of that same type of tree. You don't need to try and put in a new type to see if it works, to see if it doesn't, because trees are slow. If you know that you live in Voi and Acacia tortilis grows well there and people are cutting them down, you already know what works. So start growing more of that same one. And just like anything in life, we always say the more care you give it, the faster it will grow. So there's sort of two ways of dispersing the seed balls. You can sort of throw and hope for the best. And like the parable, some on the rocky path and what have you. But then we've seen with farmers, if you're weeding them, you're putting manure, you're chasing the goats away, you're looking after it, of course you get a faster, larger, quicker tree and everything.
Okay. So it's not just like throwing in the wild and waiting for it to happen.
Well, you can do that. So it really depends back again on your cost-benefit analysis and costing analysis. Because for some areas, like we've partnered with many conservation groups, the rangers will be on patrol. They happen to be driving over vast or flying over vast areas of land where they're seeing forest degradation, charcoal making. For them to start weeding and planting and watering, that's not practical within their business. So if they can throw a handful of seeds out and get 10%, that's still cheaper than trying to get someone on site digging holes and pouring buckets of water, especially in drought-prone areas where people might not even have drinking water at home. So to ask someone to carry water for 5 kilometers on their back, a lot of people just think they're foolish. So that's where you sort of benefit out. Is it cheaper to just throw it and then have a higher sort of attrition rate on the seed balls versus is it cheaper to... So it's very much site dependent and people dependent.
That's true. What are some of the locations that have been a very successful venture for you guys?
So we've really tried to focus our efforts on dryland areas because there's a lot of wonderful tree planting organizations doing so much work in the water towers and the highlands. But again, from our experience, most of the charcoal production in Kenya is coming from the rangelands and dryland parts of the country, which are inherently a harder place to grow trees. There are livestock, there's lots of wildlife even, there's not that much rain. So the best places we've seen it really work are in some of the old SGR quarries around Savo that the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust is rehabilitating. some parts near Narok on the outside of the Mara.
Yeah.
So we were trying to advise people you don't really need to seed inside of a park because a park still has baboons and elephants and birds and not very much human damage because it's a controlled area. But it's the periphery and outside of wild areas where a lot of the charcoal making, fence posts, degradation, deforestation is happening.
Yeah.
So we worked onto like Diamond Trust Bank just outside of Narok, and they planted over 100,000 seedlings from Seedballs, and it probably took 2.5 hours with 100 community members and a small helicopter.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's very interesting because, some parts in those areas, you can't really get to the tops of the hills easily unless you're desperate to make charcoal or whatever. But there's also dangerous wildlife and whatever, so you don't want people walking around so much of it. So being able to mix match with organizations who, like Mara Elephant Project, who are working on wildlife conservation, but also saying habitat restoration is a key part of their mandate. It's been really interesting bringing so many diverse partners together to have this work. Of course, the best successes, like I said earlier, on-farm people who are really looking after the trees, you're chasing the goats away, you're weeding it, doing a manure, what have you.
You've actually just mentioned what I was thinking about. I've seen you've worked with corporates like Bolt, Greenspoon, and Big Life. Would you say that people are paying more attention to climate change right now, and what more could be done with the corporate scene?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's been our experience, especially recently, we've had a wonderful partnership with Bolt, who's been our biggest partner to date. They're doing over 30 tons of seed balls through 12 different local partners that we're working with all over the country. And the sort of common thing that I've seen with a lot of these different ones who have been willing to do this has been they're typically new companies who also appreciate innovation. And it's interesting because there's sort of two types of corporates, I feel like. There's the old dinosaur, not going to mention names.
Yes.
You can all imagine who they are. Where their bureaucracy is so entrenched, doing anything different, doing anything new is very complicated. A lot of the employees probably not very concerned about climate change because they may not feel it in their day-to-day lives. And then I think there's this new sort of type of hybrid business that is seeing the long-term investment in society as something that's a key part of what they have to do as a business. And companies like Greenspoon and Bolt and DTB and what have you, it's been wonderful seeing that understanding of what you can do as a business that's not only good for your business in the long term, but good for your employees and everyone who lives in the areas where you operate. It's certainly picking up. And I really hope some of those old guard type of companies
will take notice.
Hopefully we're taking notice, or they'll be run out of town, I think, one day. Because I think the future is hybrid businesses looking at beyond the basic bottom line.
That's so true. And we also kind of talked about the relationship between you and the government. Are you receiving any support from them, and what would you recommend that they do more about it?
We've had very excellent technical backstopping from the Kenya Forest Research Institute, KEFRI. And they've been wonderful because they're very much tasked with innovation within the forestry sector. They supply high quality seeds, and you can track each of the batches back to where the tree actually was produced from. We've worked a little bit with Kenya Wildlife Service. Last 2 years ago, we did Planting Summit WRTI. Again, with us, when the big forestry sort of push was happening 2017-18, and the president said, this is private sector, government, everyone has to come together to make sure we're hitting and exceeding our goals of especially indigenous forest cover, our focus has really been how do we bring in private sector as much as possible. And as a private sector business, I find it a bit easier also to work with the private sector than with the government. But we've definitely had very interesting support from many members of them. We had the Senator Ladama Olkinia one time, like 4 years ago, organized an airplane on rehabilitating one of the parts of the Mao above Narok. And they dropped cedar and African olive seed balls along one big section there. And then also beyond even government, we've worked with churches, with temples, with mosques, so it's almost like a trans-religious. And I think almost everyone is starting to realize what we're not caring for the environment is coming back to bite us.
That's true.
And it's expensive and painful. And I think that's a very good lesson for you to know that it's only going to get worse if we don't start doing stuff about it.
That's really true. And what are some of the challenges that you have faced as Seedballs Kenya?
Like every small business in Kenya, there's the standard challenges that I'm sure any small business owner can appreciate.
Yes.
Definitely anything new is always interesting to do. Even some of the Kefri people, when we first started doing this, said, you're very brave to be going against sort of, because a lot of the forestry thinking in Kenya is still based in that colonial forestry plantation management type of thing, where if you're planting trees, they have to be in straight lines, they have to be 2 meters apart, it has to be in a 2 by 2 foot hole or whatever. And especially with forest restoration, you always think, where have you ever seen a natural forest that grows in straight lines?
That's true.
And where have you ever seen trees that grow exactly 2 meters apart? It's only an artificial, which, makes sense. If you're doing pine plantations for timber or something, then you're going to do it in an organized manner. But when you're looking at forest restoration and natural systems, you almost would rather have what's known as like tree islands, where there's small little batches of high density Miyawaki style mini forests coming up, especially in community areas where people do grazing. So there's still space for grass, there's still space for trees coming back in. So doing something that sort of challenges those traditional 1940s, 1950s, the only way to plant trees in Africa is eucalyptus and straight lines. That's been deeply embedded in a lot of people's heads because that's what the training came from English, and that sort of carried over. And so that's definitely been a bit of a challenge just because it is unusual, but then a lot of people also understand when you look out at landscapes, where did those trees come from? Nobody was planting these old growth trees as seeds in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
The next sort of challenge, though, that's been also interesting is now getting people to understand the importance of grass and pasture restoration. And we've been doing grass seed balls for a couple of years now, and increasingly getting a bit more interest, but still so many people don't understand why grass, or what does that mean? Or some people will say, oh, but the cows will just eat it. And, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
That's how you do it. But grasslands, 70% of Kenya is dryland grasslands. You don't find wall-to-wall forests typically in most of those arid areas. And that mosaic forest of a few acacia trees, some other species, plus lots of different types of grasses and wildflowers and forbs is something that we're really looking into now, of how do we make better seed balls with companion types of, say you're a sheep farmer, say you're a camel farmer, say you keep cattle. Each of those things has an indigenous type of plant that it prefers to eat the most. And the nice things with those versus Boma roads or one of these hybrids, a lot of these indigenous plants are of course accustomed to the droughts and to the types of soils where they are. And this opens up a very big potential for working with communities to buy seed from them, because the people who know what sheep eat the best is someone who looks after sheep all day long.
Yeah.
So we're trying to work our way into doing sort of seed balls with a few communities around Kenya where their livestock herders can start supplementing income by doing seed collection and then use that for grassland restoration. And some of the grasses in Kenya are incredible. They live over 40 years. Their roots are more than 8 feet deep in the soil. There's more than 200 species of grass just in Kenya alone. And you go on safari and you look at the last thing you're really thinking about
is the grass.
It's as complex as Kakamega Forest, basically, as an ecosystem and as biodiverse. And it's something that's really been exciting, trying to educate people more about that. And also ourselves learning more about this as well. And as a barbecue business, we want the grasslands and the charcoal
to go together. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Sadly, we've come to the end of the podcast, and I have really enjoyed this conversation. We have a very important day this Saturday at Ololua, courtesy of Seedballs Kenya and KOFISI. So, anything you'd recommend that people look out for and with seed balls?
Yes, definitely. When you're walking, I always tell people you should think like a tree.
Okay.
If you're going to be living somewhere for the next 100 years, where is it? Is it somewhere that you get a bit of extra water? Is it right where the goats are walking? Is it in the thick weeds and brambles or whatever? And also enjoy yourselves. Have so much fun. There's all of these small steps towards walking around in a beautiful forest like Ololua.
Yeah.
And, just take a minute, look and breathe in, learn one name of one new tree. Watch how the butterflies are flying and why they're doing what they're doing. And you'll see that truly ecology is 10 times as complicated as rocket science.
I cannot wait. Yeah.
And I'd just like to say a big thank you to you and the KOFISI team for supporting this.
Thank you for
we look forward to doing more of this in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Teddy.
Excellent.
Okay.